maybe if I can sum it up, I would say still our responsibility, and this is the same thing we did 20 years ago. What did we do 20 years ago? We said we as designers, as architects, have to look into these technical systems in order to claim authorship, and turn this into architectural tools, versus wait that somebody else, thinks about how we should design and then obliges to do this. And this now is probably the same questions. Are we able, and this probably is a question to the next generation very much, to look at these new, scary, but very powerful, interesting things that are around as design tools and not just as tools to automate and to increase productivity of what you have been doing, so far. Matthias and I, we met at ETH, so at the university during studies in the first half of the 90s. We actually never met in a design class, but we met in a lab. This was a computer lab. ETH, as a big technical university, very early on had very fast computers, workstations, silicon graphics, that were at disposal of students, and this lab actually was open 24/7 back then, and was a fantastic opportunity for all the architectural students that were interested in the digital. Although it was back then completely, to imagine simple to be able to render an image and move it in real time was a fantastic experience. These machines with a reality engine, this was $500,000, CPU and the memory to run these things that a few years later would then be possible on a gamer PC. But back then this was very exclusively, and this place in space and time, brought us together.
Yeah, well, the robots, of course, they came in much later. So after our studies, we had different experiences, also teaching at ETH, etc., as assistants. And at one point we saw, when we actually already started our architecture office, where the goal was, of course, to do also classical architecture, we saw the job ad for a professorship called Machinic Processes in Architecture at the time. And since we were a young digital office, so let's say digital was at the core of our activity and architecture was the mission, we then decided to apply. And once we were selected for this professorship, which was of course a great chance, we were discussing with what tools to work. And that's where the robot actually came into play, because at one point we thought we already knew that we wanted to work with physical construction, with fabrication, so that we wanted to connect the virtual, the digital with the physical processes. And then we thought, okay, how do we do it if we purchase some specialized machines to do that? We will be focused very much on a single process, let's say, laser cutting or bending, or, there are specialized machines. But if you zoom back, you want a generic machine, you want machines that can do many things. And the robot is this machine, this kind of bridge between the digital and the analog, the physical, the crafts world, which we then actually, in a way, discovered for us, but also conceptually chose to bridge that gap.
We have been educated at ETH. ETH is a very classical, very traditional architectural school. I would say not digital at all. Also in the 90s, not involved in any way in the digital architectural discussion. That was more in the Anglo-Saxon and in the US a topic. And we were sort of a strange mix, because on one hand, as teenager in the 80s, we were confronted with the first toys you could program. So that didn't have a graphical user interface. It was a few years too early. And these toys were Commodore 64 and Ataris and many of these things, you had to program. So we sort of experienced the power of formalizing logics and running processes in a completely abstract digital, not even graphical context. Then we were confronted with the possibility to bring these things into geometry, so into a virtual space, with these powerful machines at ETH. But at the same time, we were interested in building architecture. So we were educated in understanding space and designing space and talking about space, And the fact that these two realms were not communicating at all back then. So there was a complete dichotomy. There were the digitals, so paperless studio, Gregolin, the complex shape, the blob, discussions that we were very much interested in, but not part of it. We were probably too young, part of another generation. And on the other side, this really will to build, to touch material, to form material, to construct, And these things were not coming together in any way. And this was a reason for us of frustration, that brought us to formulating our program. And the office started in 2000 with this program to bring these two things together, as directly as possible. And I would say the M table, that is also on show here, was expression of this, stubborn try to really, bring these two things to communicate to each other. The completely virtual, the digital, the mobile phone, these new technologies emerging, and the material, walnut wood,
For us, working with also low-tech materials and understanding how material wants to behave by itself, and then intervening and playing with those processes is an important point. It has been a discovery also on what is possible to do with these materials, and accepting design-wise what that kind of entails, how that kind of enriches the design language in a way of architecture. The letting go towards these materials and processes was probably a discovery when we started to work with robotic processes. We realized quite quickly, already working with brick walls, like the programmed columns or the combined winery, etc., that you could not, or it would not be fruitful to try to imitate human craftsmanship, try to achieve perfection or an imitation of human craftsmanship, but to rather understand what robots can do and what their limitations are, what material can do, and what limitations are, and to, in a way, let go towards the simplification, also being quite pragmatic of what these quite primitive systems often, a brick and the robot, there is not much complexity in a way to it. What degrees of freedom are in that encounter between machine and material, and then trying to explore that and accept that also, with gravity, with connection techniques, etc. If you then start to understand that with simple construction system like bricks, you can naturally we kind of started to go towards more materials like clay or rubble, materials which have an own behavior in how they aggregate, are harder to control or sometimes not really controllable, and actually appreciate that uncontrollability. And then you start to tease out in that process how you can work with that uncontrollability and how you can nudge that in one or the other direction in order to give shape to a process which has its own logic and reveals its own inner behavior. So, for example, when we worked with foams that would foam up over time, you have the very beautiful overlap of having a robotic path which lays out foams, and then a time-delayed foaming up of those foams, and then the result becomes a composition of these two processes which interweave into one another and form something which would be very complex to fabricate otherwise, very intricate in its result, but can only be done through this intertwining of these two processes. Or, for example, the clay, shooting clay through space and waiting for its impact onto one another and seeing the deformation of these clay bullets into one another in remote material deposition are just very beautiful processes and also inventions in themselves. How can you use ballistic curves and the impact force to actually build something, build a real world architectural structure. So it becomes very playful and very joyful to actually work in a way with the limitations, but also actually let these limitations free up the imagination of what you could do with materials.
These two categories of high tech and low tech probably are misleading, because they push us, or they oblige us to think again in terms of a dichotomy of high culture, low culture, vernacular versus monumental, of the digital versus the analog. And we think that it's not about this. That it's about understanding all these phenomena. Some of them are as old as humanity or culture, let's say building with bricks or with stones. This is a thing that belongs to, I would say, to what we could understand that we'll call building culture, or it's a process of thousands of years of evolution, economical evolution, material technological evolution, and so on. And a robot that at the end, if you want to be honest, when we introduced it in architecture in 2005, was not high-tech at all in terms of this, how we normally think about this category. This was an industrial machine invented and developed in the 50s, applied at very large scale. And at the end, it's just axis in a certain kinematic chain controlled by motors that are digitally driven. And so it's the possibility to reach a point in space and eventually do something like this. So it's about control. And I would say that our interest to transfer this machine into architecture, into the architectural discussion, was not about automating anything, but what about reasoning on what would the difference be if such a simple task, pick-and-play task, as to move a brick from a stack to a building is performed by a human versus a robot. And the first projects we did, Gantenbein is on show here, was just about very slightly rotating the brick. So staying in a regular runner bond, and then to slightly rotate the brick on its own axis by maximum 17 degrees. And this is, you could say, almost nothing, but it hadn't been done until then for this very simple reason that the human has a very hard time to control a rotation between 0 or let's say minus 17 to plus 17 degrees in a reasonable way. Would have to measure it every time. And what we realized for the robot, it's absolutely unproblematic to do this, because it's just about data. It's just a number at the very right point in time and space, in a program, in a process. And if these things are choreographed in the right way, you get this thing with an incredible easiness, There is a term in German that we like to use, and we never really found a perfect translation to English. It's Selbstverständlichkeit. So I think that just this comes out of its own logic, that nobody would ever question, doesn't make sense to question it, And the robot rotating the brick is just selbstverständlich, why not? And if you start to look at things in these terms, and what Matthias just said, the possibility to just introduce control in space, and eventually a material that has a very complex self behavior, can be choreographed in the right way, then this distinction between high tech and low tech starts to make little sense, because you could argue that the craft or the technology of bricklaying is a very high-tech thing, while a robot is just banal 6-axis, in a certain sequence controlled by a stupid, controller.
Where are these technological developments actually heading, particularly with new developments like AI and these complex aggregations of systems on top of one another? And where would we like them to go, right? It's two different questions, but they somehow relate. I mean, my personal view, I always try to not split technology too far apart from culture. So in my own understanding, I would say, technologies in a way lead or embody in a way in techniques in craftsmanship. After a while, become part of once they're mastered, that being part of a kind of craftsmanship. Once the humans are actually taking a hold of the discoveries, and a bit later they become part of a culture. So I think when things are new, they're always, in a way foreign. You sense a distance. They're exciting, but they're also threatening, and we've seen that throughout history. But over time, they always, in a way, become integrated in the culture. So I don't see that big separation between culture and technology. And I think my hope in that sense would be that as architects, as designers, as creators in this world, we take in these changes in a positive sense and start to interpret them in a very, let's say, human or even beyond human, sense that we can develop cultures, new cultures with it, which are in a way, productive, sustainable, joyful, pleasureful also. It sounds maybe a bit too nice to be true, but in a way I believe that process is always ongoing and will be ongoing also in the future. But it needs dedication to it also. Where I would see it a bit more critical is with a very highly techno-positivist approach, where you think that all these technologies are just solutions to current problems and just being functionalized. Of course, they have a function, and I think that function needs to be explored. That will also continue. It's important, for example, that digital fabrication becomes part, really also of the building industries, etc. But that is going to happen anyway in one or the other way. I think as architects, it's more the question, how does it change, our relation to our environments, to the spaces around us, to the materials around us, and our habitat. And I think that very direct relation, which I would say is reflected through the culture of how we deal with those technologies, that would be probably our passion to contribute to that culture.